I would definitely say in those biggest moments, my number was called, my heart rate would be lower than anybody sitting in the stands.
Why?
Because I prepared so many times psychologically, I put myself in that moment that I wanted to be the number called. I wanted to be the person that could propel his team. Terrific athletes have that ability to be able to like slow these moments down. It's like when the ball would be in the air, I would see it and everything around me seemed like it was just moving very slow. And then I would catch it and then everything would speed back up. I could hear the crowd, I could hear everything else. While it was happening, I didn't feel or hear anything.
Welcome to Grey Matter. I'm Declan Kelly, founder, chairman, and CEO of Consello. I've spent the last 30 plus years advising the CEOs who are leading the world's top companies. If there's one thing I've learned in that time, the best leaders think differently. That wiring, that grey matter, separates the truly exceptional leaders from everyone else. Understanding it is what allows us at Consello to help the best in the world be even better. This podcast exists because the most accomplished leaders agreed to sit down and talk about something they rarely discuss publicly, how their minds actually work. Most people know Larry Fitzgerald as an 11-time Pro Bowler and now a first-ballot Hall of Famer in the NFL. Yet perhaps his greatest accomplishment over his 17-year career was his ability to learn from the moments that tested him the most. This was evident just hours after a devastating Super Bowl loss, where Larry was already contemplating what the experience could teach him about winning and losing. He credits that mindset to the way he grew up, following his parents and watching professional athletes, constantly looking for ways to improve. It is a pursuit that he has carried beyond football and into his work, investing in a diverse portfolio of successful businesses. He has now become as successful off the field as he was on it. Larry's story is a reminder that greatness comes from finding something to learn in every moment, most especially the hardest ones. This is Grey Matter. Larry Fitzgerald, welcome to Grey Matter.
Thank you so much, Declan. Glad to be here with you, man.
I'm so delighted to be here in Minnesota with you and here in this hallowed hall where you spent so much of your youth. Tell me why we always have our guests pick the location, but why did you pick this particular location?
And this is my high school. So a lot of my formative years and the development, the teachers, the administration, all the things that, I think kind of helped shape me as an individual and as a young man kind of happened in these hallways in this building. And, a lot of my greatest memories with my family and my friends, my classmates and basketball and all of the things and football all kind of happened here. And so like this brings me a lot of really positive memories.
They told me that in mid-September, they're dedicating the stadium to you.
Yeah. I mean, it's surreal to think, when you come here as a, 14, 15-year-old kid, like you can't even conceptualize one day having something like that happen. It makes you very, very appreciative of the people that poured into you when you were at this place, because they didn't have any clue that my life would kind of go in this direction. I had no clue, but it didn't change how they treated me, how they, invested their time and resources into me. And, to be associated with a wonderful organization and school like that means a lot.
So one of the things that I try to focus on in Grey Matter is how people think. And with athletes, it's always really interesting to understand what makes them from within. And I've always thought about you as being very thoughtful about the way you've done everything. And we'll get into that in a bit more detail later, but where does that come from?
My parents always forced us to make decisions, as children, the ones that they allowed us to. And they always kept us on our toes. So I'll give you an example. My parents would be like, let's go, we're leaving. But they would never tell us where we were going. They would never say, we're going to be gone for this long time, or we're going to be outside or inside. And so, the first couple of times, you deal it and you're like, man, Mom, why don't you just tell me we were going to be here? And so what would happen is, like, I would be prepared for anything. Like, I would bring a ball, I'd bring a jacket, because I didn't know what we were doing, how long we were going to go. And so I just became more prepared when I would get in those situations.
What's really interesting about you is you're very intentional about your relationships. Whenever I talk to anybody about you when you're not there, they all say the same thing. Unbelievably nice guy, unbelievably inquisitive. I saw you said sometime years ago, that in school you used to get into trouble for being the one that asked all the questions. But actually, that is one of your secret virtues in asking people and being very, very intentional about how you do that. Where does that come from?
Yeah, I've always been the kid that is just really inquisitive. I wanted to understand. And I see a lot of like even with my kids and I'll see somebody talking to them and I can obviously know I obviously see that they don't understand something that somebody is saying, but they won't ask them. They use a word that they don't understand, or somebody talks about, oh, you know about this and that, and you just you shake your head like you know, but you have no clue. That never made sense to me. The whole sole purpose of communication is for me to understand what you're trying to tell me, and if I don't understand, I need to communicate that to you so I can understand it. I understood that at a very young age, and so I would get in trouble at practice asking questions about concepts we were running. Hey, we're gonna do this concept. Like, that doesn't make sense because the last time we did this, it did, so they would, shut up, Larry, I don't want to hear that, so I would get myself in trouble as a child, but, I was fortunate enough to have enough people that were like, there's no dumb questions and there's dumb times to ask questions, but there's no dumb questions. So I learned as I got older, okay, I have that question, but I'm gonna ask Declan about that later when we have a little bit of free time. And so as long as I can remember, I've always been that kid.
You often joke about, Minnesota nice. I know you often talk about it, but it's obviously real. There's this beautiful incongruity between the guy who is, one of the nicest people I know and the guy who always handed the football to the official after he got a touchdown. Yet you had this ferocious athletic ability where nobody was ever able to stop you, really. How did that manifest yourself when you were able to be present in that way, knowing that you could do both at the same time?
Yeah, I had to master that. I was a little hot-headed early on, and I knew that for me to perform at my best, I couldn't be that way. And guys would antagonize me. They would pinch me. They would poke me. Do things to get me agitated, and I would erupt when I was younger. And I saw that it was detrimental to my process. And so I started to be able to understand how to manage my emotions and make sure I stay calm in these environments. And like, even sometimes when I'm calm, I kind of like to equate it to a duck in a pond. Like, you look at a duck on top of the water and it looks so elegant, just going across, and then there's a camera underneath and the legs are just going really, really fast. And I feel like that's kind of how I am, in these big moments. I'm very calm, but inside, like, there's a inferno firing away inside of me, and it makes me very passionate about what I'm doing and enthusiastic, but I also understand that I need to be calm in the moment for me to be able to get the best out of myself.
At the very, very peak, whenever you consider that to be, in those moments where it really all was on the line, were you feeling calm in the moment? I mean, our mutual friend Tom and others always say that when it comes down to that actual moment, everything else around you freezes and you somehow slow down. We talk about this a lot, but is that what happened to you?
Absolutely, Declan. If you'd have taken me to a Super Bowl, I played in, and if I would love to have been able to have like a whoop on. Now it's cool to be able to see like Rory McIlroy at the Masters, and you can kind of see his elevated heart rate and how he's feeling and going through it emotionally. They didn't have that when I was playing, but I would definitely say in those biggest moments, my number was called. In the most clutch times, my heart rate would be lower than anybody sitting in the stands.
Why?
Because I prepared so many times psychologically. I put myself in that moment that I wanted to be the number called. I wanted to be the person that could propel his team to those great heights. And I think really terrific athletes have that ability to be able to like slow these moments down. It's like when the ball would be in the air, I would see it and everything around me seemed like it was just moving very slow. And then I would catch it and then everything would speed back up. I could hear the crowd. I could hear everything else. But while it was happening, I didn't feel or hear anything.
Was it like that when you were out here on the field around the corner from us? Like when you were young, growing up? I mean, what I'm trying to get at is how much of it is genetic, physical gift that you have, and how much of it is I sit down and I really taught myself to really slow things down. Which is it?
I think I was like that very young. I think I got better. And I think I was inoculated in these moments, being able to put yourself in these pressure cookers more frequently. You get better. I mean, you watch guys in tournament golf, right? You see guys who they say couldn't get over the hump, or they couldn't do this, and then they finally get over the hump, and then they just start winning because now they understand how to be able to manage those big moments. And I think the more you do it, the better you become at it. And I definitely think it slowed down for me younger, but I think I got much better as I got older and the more situations I was in.
I love reading about your story and hearing from you about your story and your parents. And, I had the privilege of briefly meeting your father once, and I know he passed recently, which is obviously tremendously sad, and your mom when you were 19. But the incredible impact they had on your life. And this person who has made all these, wonderful achievements, but also has stayed unbelievably grounded. How much of that do you attribute to how you grew up?
100% of it, 100%. And, on my mom's side, she was in the healthcare space. And, she was always dealing with people who had breast cancer or were terminally ill with HIV and AIDS. And so, heck, I would be coming home from a Vikings football game as a ball boy. And where the Vikings Stadium is, where old Metrodome was right across the street from Hennepin County Medical Center, which is a tier 1 trauma center. And people that are going through the worst things go to this facility. And we will be leaving the Metrodome, huge game, 70,000 people cheering, watching Randy Moss and Chris Carter catch touchdown passes. And we leave and we stop at Hennepin County Hospital to see somebody that's in there being read their last rites and about to pass away from complications of HIV and AIDS. So it was like this wild range of experiences that I would have as a child, like the highest of the highs, right to the lowest of lows. So I never really got too off kilter with the success or with the failures, because I knew there was a lot in between those things. And I think the difference in my mom's jobs and my dad's job were so vast, but I think it gave me a unique perspective of how to be able to manage those things. And I think as I got older, I got better and better at kind of dealing with it, and like we're all just human beings. And I think, my travels around the world also has given me pretty unique perspectives. Like no matter where you are, what God you worship, your socioeconomic background, like you just want to love and be loved. Like very simple premise, right? And I try not to deviate from the human element that we all experience.
It's interesting when you talk about the life you had and how you grew up. Your father obviously was a very well-known reporter for many, many decades, and same name as you, Larry Fitzgerald Sr., and you had lots of famous people walking in and out of your house all the time. I also remember you saying that one day your grandfather introduced you to some people. Now, what did he say?
So my grandfather was an Alpha fraternity. He pledged in at Xavier University down in New Orleans, where he met my grandmother before they got married. And he was kind of president emeritus of the club in Chicago. And there's probably, I don't know, 40 or 50 Alphas that were in the Chicago area getting together for an event. I think I was in my 5th or 6th year in the NFL, and I was like multiple time All-Pro. I was like at the height of my powers, and I thought I was the cat's meow. And I remember going, and my grandfather invited me, "Hey, come meet some of my friends." And he invites me in, and all the guys are patting me on the back as I walk through. And my grandfather kind of quiets everybody down and said, "Hey, I want you guys to all meet my grandson, Larry Fitzgerald Jr." And, I'm thinking he's going to say, multiple time this and all of these accolades. He said, "He's my only grandchild that hasn't graduated from college." So like I went from like here to here immediately, because like education was like the one thing that they always harped on. They talked about, they stressed the importance of it. And, even when I was at that point in my career, my grandfather's like, "Hey, you get hurt, you break your knee or leg or whatever, you're done. And you have to rely on what you know and what you understand and the skill set you developed, and you need to get to work and get this done." And so he was always stressing me. My mom was always stressing me. My dad was always stressing me. And, I have a cousin that's a professor at Kellogg. I got professors that are doctors. I got professors that are I got cousins that are, partners at McKinsey, and, you name it. Like, I'm probably one of the least accomplished ones in my family, but they were always harping on it. So it was really big and very important, to follow through on education.
You went back to university, got your degree while you were playing.
Yeah, I did. So I fulfilled that promise to my mom, that I would get my degree. I came out as a sophomore in college, so I had quite a bit of credits to make up. And so I think I did it in about 4 years' time. Every off season, I would start taking credits, and finally was able to graduate, which I was very happy to be.
And this whole concept of continuous learning, obviously, I think a lot of people have heard the story about how you asked to become an intern in a bank when no one else would have thought of that, but also, going to Harvard Business School, completing various different elements of your education. There weren't many people doing that when you were playing, especially, because it was so much easier to do other things. How did you balance having to do that as well as continuing to be an athlete?
Well, I think being an athlete actually puts you in a really unique position because you have an inordinate amount of time, free time in the off season, and you can fill it with a bunch of stuff. But I always wanted to make sure I was doing things that were actually going to enhance me, that were going to help me make the inevitable transition out of the game a little smoother. I see a lot of guys who struggle when they're done playing the game. They don't know exactly what to do. It has nothing to do with money either. Like guys save their money, but they lose their purpose. When you hit the ground with your feet hit the ground in the morning, you're like, what am I going to do? I've been doing this thing since I was 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years old. Like, what do I do now? And I never wanted to be in that position. I always wanted to have a pretty clear path of what it is that I was interested in, what I want to spend my time in, and doing. And so I would spend time with different CEOs, shadow days, and I would do internships. I go back some executive business courses, and it's something I really, really enjoyed, and it definitely challenged me. And I was around other people, especially in these business courses at Kellogg or GSB or HBS or Wharton or wherever I would go. I would be around these executives who were 34, 35 years old. They were managers and running big P&Ls, and I was wondering like, man, like these guys they're my age and they're crushing it. Like what are they thinking? What are they doing? And you start building these relationships and you be able to have like this de facto board of trustees, I like to say, where I can tap into people and ask them questions about, things that are coming up in my life, and be able to have that was something I really, really valued.
This whole cultural dynamic within you as a person who reads a lot and has all of that information at their fingertips, it's yielded a lot of success for you in business as well. Are you consciously doing that all the time, or where is that coming from?
No, I wouldn't say it's a conscious effort. It's something like I'm just guided, by things. And, sometimes things weigh heavy on my heart. I see something, I read something, and I'll start doing research on organizations that are, championing these causes, and I try to find out and understand like where are the funding gaps and things that, like I'm just really curious and understanding, why things happen, and what role can I play in, being able to make it a better place. My mom and dad, I wouldn't say they were out, in front doing a lot, but they were always doing work behind the scenes. And that's something I kind of pride myself on, and making sure that you're on the right side of history. And there's a lot of people out there that are struggling with just basic needs. And, people like us are in a really good position to be able to be a use and be helpful. And that's something that I really think a lot about.
I had the privilege of interviewing Steve Kerr and Mark Messier and Carl Lewis over the last couple of months, and we talked a lot about the connectivity between the mental side and the physical side, and how people forget that the muscle that matters most is the one that's between your ears, and how you actually do that on a consistent basis. And in your case, because you had such a long career, how much of that was something that you focused on, and how did you train your mind to do that?
That's a great question. Like, I don't know if I was consciously training my mind to do those things, but I knew that at every single step of the way, there's always challenges. So when you're 20 years old and you're coming into the league and you've had a lot of success at the collegiate level, people are like, man, does his skill set, does it translate to the pro game? Can he do what he did in college? And then when you show that you can do that in the pros, and you get a new contract, your highest paid player, in your position in the league, right? And they say, oh, is he going to stay hungry? Now he's got his money. Like, is he going to stay focused? And then you continue to get better, and now you're the best in the game. And they say, is he going to rest on his laurels? He's the best. And then when your game starts to diminish, it's like he's long in the tooth now. Like, how much longer can he play? Like, there's always some obstacle you're fighting, no matter where you are in life. And like, you just have to fight that. You just fight it at every single step. When you're being patted on the back, and, Nick Saban talks about a lot about the rat poison. Like, I didn't read anything. I didn't engage in social media. I didn't really like want to get into that, good or bad. I thought it was just, it wasn't good for me to be able to digest all that information. And then, as you get older, people talking about this and that. And like, I always had an ability to be able to focus in on the things that I can control. Most of the things you have no control over. The things that I did have control over was how I put effort into what I was doing. And then the mental approach that I took to everything that I did, was it positive? When I walked in that building and we lost 2 games in a row, I could come in there with my head down, or I could come in there with my head up and talk about the things that we need to improve on and what it's going to take for us to be able to dig our way out of there, because nobody's coming to save us, and so being able to have that type of mindset and that resolve, the mental fortitude, I think was something that really helped me.
I think one of the best examples of that might have been in 2013 when Bruce Arians asked you to switch from wide receiver to the slot. And, I think you said at the time, inside it felt like a slight, but you also, because you were the best in the world at that time, and you became one of the best blocking receivers of all time after that. So what were you thinking when he came to you and said, this is what we're going to do? And how did you make that adjustment? Because I think for people who are watching this, this is the equivalent of somebody saying you're running a Fortune 100 company, and now we'd like you to go run a Fortune 500 company, but play like a Fortune 100 CEO. And it was interesting because you still had some incredible years when you were in that position. What was that like?
I think like most anybody, when you are dealt something like that, like immediately your ego takes over. And I'm not one to, like, there's things that you hear every single day. I'm never one to like spout out really quickly what I'm thinking. I think it's better for me to kind of step away, process it, look at everything that is involved, and then make a rational decision when emotions are not involved. And that is one of the times that I think it really served me well, because when he told me, I was like, why I'm doing this? And then what I didn't realize is that he saw the bigger picture, and I wasn't mature enough. I didn't have the insight to be able to understand his vision of what we were to do. And I think when you are sometimes around really good leaders, sometimes they have foresight that you just are not privy to, and you have to be able to rely on that. And I was fortunate enough that I displayed a little bit of maturity. At 29 years old, I've been in the league for quite a few years at that point. I've had some ups and downs. We had been in some losing situations, and he had won everywhere he'd gone. And so I trusted what he had planned for us, and it worked out well. Had not done that and listened and been locked in and focused the way I was, my career would definitely not have had the upswing that I had. And, those years I was with Coach Arians. And so I think it was a great example for me that, sometimes your pride can get in the way and block some of the blessings that are out there for you. And also, like, there's other ways for you to get better. Like, he made me a better player by challenging me at that point. I was well accomplished. I'd done a lot. And he saw something even greater from me, that I could be a guy. He didn't take away anything from me. Like, he did not make me a worse player, he made me a better player. He gave me more tools to put in my toolkit, which I was really appreciative of. I just didn't see it initially.
At the Super Bowl in Tampa, you were, 35 seconds or something away from winning a Super Bowl. And I remember watching you at the end of the game. Sounds completely surreal, but how you handled yourself at the end of that. And everybody was saying, oh my God, it's amazing to watch this game, but also it's amazing. There is one guy that, if even the Steelers fans were saying, there was one guy we wish could get, a Super Bowl and get a ring. It was you. What were you feeling, apart from the obvious things like disappointment? How did you process that?
I was completely gutted. It's to be so close to something that you want so bad, and to have it ripped from your fingers. It was like one of the worst feelings I ever had in my life, to be that close. But, it's life. Like, there's things that you always want that you're never going to attain, and you have to be able to deal with those things. I never got a chance to get back on that platform to be able to try to win another championship. And, even now, years later, it still stings, not being able to get over the hump. But, that's life. That's sports. It deals some devastating blows at times, but there's a silver lining in a lot of things. I remember being in the locker room, somebody coming to me. I remember I'm crying, and I lift my head up, and they say somebody wants to speak to you outside the locker room, and they didn't tell me who it was. I remember going outside the locker room, and it was Mr. Rooney, the owner of the Steelers, and he could have been in that locker room celebrating with his team, but I had known Mr. Rooney since I was 18 years old. The Steelers practice facility was actually attached to my facility at University of Pittsburgh. And so I would sometimes have lunch with him at the facility.
He was a great man.
I mean, a terrific human being, has so much wisdom and insight. And I remember him calling me out, and I just saw him, and he literally had a tear in his eye, and it wasn't a tear from him happiness. He was sad for me, and like he embraced me, and like I just think like, man, like no matter what I do in life, if I triumph, I have pitfalls. I want to be able to handle success with that type of dignity, and so like I'm at my weakest moment, but somebody who was at the pinnacle of what they aspire to do still had the grace and humbleness to come over and check on me. And like that always like really stuck out to me about how I wanted to conduct myself, And so like there's always things that you learn and when you're at the bottom, and then there's things that you learn at the top. And like so like that was still one of like the greatest memories I had from that. Like I'm gutted, and Mr. Rooney takes the time to come over and see me. I'm like, man, like that's cool. And so you learn so many cool lessons, through life.
I think one of the most admirable things is that you never sought or looked for a trade away to another team. Stayed the whole time with one team. Why?
I wanted to fix the place where I was at. It's easy for you to look out on the horizon and say, oh man, look at this, look at that, look how nice this is. You look at your own situation and you say, hey, it's not as pretty. And people want to go run to where it's at, where the pretty stuff is. And I never was wired like that. I wanted to elevate, the people around me. I wanted to elevate my community, my city. Those things were really important to me. And so I'm not going to sit here and lie to you and tell you that the thought never crossed my mind. And even the opportunity did present itself on different occasions. And it was not ever something I really wanted to do. And also I'm not somebody who like we talked about earlier, that makes hasty decisions. I looked at Phoenix as a place that I was going to live for the rest of my life. It was my new home. And there was young kids that I had met and organizations that I had partnered with through my foundation that I knew if I went to different cities, I wouldn't be able to have that same meaningful impact. And I thought about like 40 years from today, like how do I want to be here? Do I want to still be here in Phoenix? Do I still want to have a part in the restaurants and real estate development and all of the other things that I knew were available to me? Like was that all worth throwing away?
Do you know how rare that is? I mean, I can't really think of another example. It's the exception, not the rule.
I mean, there's two different ways to think about it. You have a very short window of opportunity as an athlete to be able to make your mark, and you never know how long that is. None of that is really in your control.
Right.
And so I don't look down upon guys who move around, and I don't necessarily admire guys who stay. It's just whatever suits you and makes you happy at the end of the day, because you have to be one who's proud of what you were able to accomplish and do at the end of the day, and you have to live with that. And so people always ask me, I get guys that, they're in their 8th or 9th year, and they'll call me up and they'll talk to me about, hey, I really want to go win somewhere. And, we talk kind of through the pluses and the minuses and things that I would think about, in making these decisions, and not telling them what they should do, just giving them like my thought process on why I did it.
In addition to your parents, you had one person who had more than one person, but a particular person, Dennis Green, who had a very formative influence in your life. Yeah. You said that you made 2 really important decisions and he was there for both of them. Talk about that if you can, because I know you've talked a little bit about it, but this was a man who really, really made a huge difference to you.
Yeah. So I think there's 2 big things. Like there's a difference between mentorship and sponsorship. And Dennis Green mentored me and he sponsored me. A mentor is somebody you call up and you get advice about key decisions in your life. A sponsor is somebody who actually like takes the reins and puts you in position to have success, right? And there's a million kids that would have loved to be a ball boy, here in the Twin Cities that would love to go and be around the greatest athletes. And I was one of the few that got an opportunity to see it. And he had no idea that I would eventually turn into a guy who was worthy of playing in the National Football League. But he saw a kid who was hungry. He saw a kid who was motivated, who wanted to learn. and he gave me a shot. And then 7 years later, you know, he becomes the head coach of the Arizona Cardinals, and they have the third pick. And wide receiver was not a position of need for us at all. You know, they drafted a receiver the year before me in the first round. They drafted Anquan Boulder in the second round. He was the NFL Rookie of the Year, and Offensive Player of the Year, his rookie year. And so they did not have a need at that position. Dennis Green, he knew my makeup. He knew my family. He knew how intrinsically motivated I was to be great. Had not had that relationship with him and him known like how I was made, how I was built, no, he probably wouldn't have taken me. But that relationship, I think, gave me a huge advantage. And, you know, he took me at that position and allowed me to kind of mature and flourish in the National Football League. And so he is directly responsible for, you know, all of the success that I had, because, you know, I wouldn't have had the career that I had not had the insight as a ball boy to be around those special players and be able to ask them questions, see how they trained, see what they ate, see how they took care of their bodies, see how they study film, see how they handled all the kids when they were getting autographs, to see the community service that they would do. Like all of these things that I was learning at 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18 around these guys helped shape my ideology and thought process of how I wanted to do it if I was lucky enough to get there. And all of that was him.
Most people get to form, you know, a real bond and a relationship with a quarterback, one or two quarterbacks in their career. You had 21 quarterbacks in your career, 21, which is a testament to two things. One, your longevity, and two, the fact that the team had a lot of different quarterbacks. And I remember you talking about before to me one time about Kurt Warner and him showing you about film and teaching you how to be a student of the game. The evolution of you inside of that whole world and learning to play with a different player 21 times, and perhaps him being a big influence on you at a certain point. How big of a deal is it to keep changing that way?
I think there's goods and bad, right? I am very comfortable with change. Like change is inevitable in life, and I'm more comfortable with it than most. I think I've always been that way, but I think Kurt is unique because of when I got to be with him and how he was able to articulate what was important about me thriving in the National Football League. And like, there's great leaders, but sometimes leaders, they lead by example. They can't really articulate why they are in the position they are. Kurt was one of those unique ones who he can demonstrate it and he can articulate it. And so I know this was probably early on in our relationship. We were in OTAs, or organized team activities, where we kind of do our thing in the spring. And I was making plays down the field, and I loved to just kind of play sandlot football. You throw it up, I'll make a play. I was bigger, stronger, more athletic than most of the guys I was playing against. And I remember him pulling me aside after practice one day and saying, "Larry, terrific athlete. Like, you got a really bright future in the game. But the way you play the game and the way that I play the game couldn't be more different." And I was like, what do you mean? I'll just throw it up and give me a chance. He said, "Yeah, that's not how I play football. I play football with timing, with precision. That's how Mike Martz taught me how to play the game when I was in St. Louis. That's how Isaac Bruce, Torrey Holt, the two receivers that I had, Oz Hakeem, Ricky Prohl, how those guys performed. And I need you to play the way they played for me to feel comfortable throwing you the football." And I'm thinking to myself, I was like, the audacity of this guy to come change me is I'm, one of the, better players in the game. And again, that was like one of those situations where I'm thinking it, but I needed to process it. And I went home and I kind of, this guy, he doesn't understand, and I'm talented. And I'm thinking to myself, like, he's the quarterback. He has to be comfortable making these decisions. And at the end of the day, it falls on his shoulders. And I came back the next day and I said, "Hey, Kurt, like, tell me what you need me to do." And we started watching tape about Isaac Bruce, 20 yards in on the end cut. It's cover two. You got to make sure you inside release, and like all these little things that I needed to learn. And, once I did that, the first year we were together, I went for like 1,400. I made my first Pro Bowl, 10 touchdowns, 100 catches, all the things that I wanted to do. All I needed to do was listen to somebody who's done it, who's experienced it, and not allow my ego to do that. And so I think it was imperative for me to be able to have somebody with that kind of humility, that kind of grace, that kind of winning, that kind of pedigree, to be able to impart that wisdom on me. And so, people always ask me who was the best quarterback that you played with. I never like answering that question because I never want to make people feel less than. But Kurt was the most important quarterback that I ever had because he taught me how to play football in a way that was different than the way I played it at the time. And so like he fundamentally changed the way I kind of interpreted my skill set and how pliable I became to coaching and other people's suggestions about things that I can improve on.
You've made an extraordinary transition to business. Obviously, you were in business while you were playing, but Larry Fitzgerald Enterprises has 160 investments last time I checked with you. You obviously had the Phoenix Suns investment. You own restaurants. You own a whole bunch of different things in real estate. How do you keep it all straight?
I got a great team. Like they kind of helps me, but I think it goes back to like just the curiosity, and wanting to really understand how businesses are thrive, how they operate. And I think, once I was playing and I had that free time in the off season, I really wanted to sink my teeth into it. And so I think around 2010, I think I was 6 years in, I really kind of started going deep into it. And I met a couple people in town in Phoenix and around the country that kind of helped me figure out, if real estate is something that you really want to understand and get better at, guys like, Fritz Wolf and Jim Davison and Robert Sarver, who are titans in the real estate business. And then I got a chance to meet Mark Peterson, who's, is one of the largest franchisees around the country. He lives in Phoenix. And I met Sam Fox, and I met Mike and Jeff Mastro from the Mastros family. And so those relationships, I was able to build those with them. And not only did they teach me, but they allowed me to invest alongside them. And it just started to grow on top of itself.
I remember one time when we were playing golf, walking up the fairway, and you took your phone out and started showing me the P&L of your restaurants. And I thought to myself, okay, and by the way, this was after you got a birdie. And I was sort of sitting there thinking, oh my God, this guy used to be, one of the greatest footballers of all time. Meanwhile, we're talking about restaurant P&Ls, and he's about to chip in for another birdie. And
I still remember it was on the 15th hole, and I hit my drive about 150 yards past yours. And we were at your ball. We couldn't even see my ball from where we were. I still remember that. Yeah.
Actually, I'm going to tell you what actually happened. Do you remember your driver head exploded? Yeah. It was like a grapefruit. I'm like, who does that? And you're like, that kind of happens every 8 weeks. Yeah. So you're let's just say you learned how to multitask on a golf course. It's all good. Hall of Fame is going to happen here in a few weeks. This broadcast is going to come out to coincide with that, and I'm honored and deeply thankful to be able to be there when you receive it. You received every honor in the game. Walter Payton Man of the Year Award, everything. There's nothing in high school, college, pro football, but you stand back as a young man still, and all the things you've done in your life, and having built all these friendships and all these things that you've done, which are quite extraordinary. Do you ever allow yourself a moment when you're riding around the lake at home, or when you're doing all the things you do, to sit back and look out the window and say, oh my God, what a life. And it's only half lived.
No, not at all. I'm actually going to talk about it in my Hall of Fame speech. And when I talk to my sons about enjoying the journey, so the only thing that I would say, and I've talked to this with like other great athletes, Wayne Gretzky, Tom, MJ. It's like when you're going through the process, you don't necessarily enjoy it. You love it, but you're not enjoying, where you are, because there's always another mountain to hike, right? It's like you get to one peak and you look out and say, there's more, there's higher to go. And in my mind, that's kind of where I am. And if I could go back and do it a little bit differently, I would take a little bit more time to appreciate some of the things that I was doing, lean in a little bit more. But I also am not naive to think that if I would have done that, I naturally might have taken my foot off the accelerator, and I might not have been able to achieve the things that I've achieved. And I didn't want that to happen then. I don't want that to happen now. But I don't know if it's the most healthy way to think about life and the way to go about it. it works for me, but I don't think it works for everybody.
This segment of the program is called the Uncharted Walk, and it's a bit of fun. You don't know what I'm going to ask you. These are quick-fire questions, but also just to get a deeper insight into a couple of things about you. So we'll walk and talk. First of all, we're here in your high school, and we're going to walk over to your jersey, which, of course, has been retired. Needless to say, it's got the number 1 for a reason. Which was harder for you, pitching investors or training in the NFL?
Pitching investors is much more difficult because I hadn't had as much practice. I hadn't developed that skill set. Training for the NFL, I've been training for a long time, so I kind of knew what I was getting myself into. And so, say definitely pitching investors is more difficult.
What was the first investment you ever made?
My grandfather every year bought a share of Berkshire Hathaway A, and so 2004, my first pick that I ever made was Berkshire Hathaway. 1 share, and I always wanted to go to the Berkshire Hathaway conference that Mr. Buffett would do in Omaha. So to be able to do that at 20 years old was something that.
How much was the share?
I want to say it's around like 60,000 or something like that.
Okay, so you made money. I assume you kept it.
Every year. Every year.
So, what's one habit or skill that you learned as a footballer that you continue to employ as a business person and as an investor?
Definitely just being prepared, walking into an investor meeting or look at diligence a company, really being prepared and knowing exactly kind of what I'm trying to get out of the meeting or, so that's one thing I would say has been a really good, trade over from ball.
You also have mentioned to me before how you like to go to where the companies are at.
Yeah.
You like to go and meet the CEOs in their habitat, in their environment, so you can learn. Is that because you like the process of immersion, or is it because you want the different experiences? What is the reason?
No, I think the biggest for me is that I think Zoom has become so prevalent. So it's easier for you to just jump on a call, right? As opposed to coming to New York and actually sitting in your office, sitting with you. I think when you do that, I think you realize I had to get up at 6 o'clock for an 8 o'clock flight to come fly to New York to have lunch with you. Like, you understood the effort that goes into it. And I think that is a differentiator and sometimes gives you the right to win.
One word about how you felt after your retirement.
I would say I was a little lost.
Lost?
Yeah.
Why?
Because I feel like you have done something for such a long period of time. And like, I remember like getting to August, around this time of the year, thinking I'm supposed to be in training camp. Like, literally, I remember waking up, getting out of the bed, like, am I supposed to be somewhere? Like like your body is so accustomed to it. So I would say for the first few months, you definitely are kind of grasping for air, but it wasn't because I wasn't doing things that I was passionate about, but it was just like inside my body, it felt like I was supposed to be doing something different.
And are you a creature of habit? Like, do you still do the same things? Do you still, maybe you don't train with the same intensity, but do you still, I know you do other things. You have a business, you play golf, you hang out with your friends, etc. But are you still a person who applies that kind of discipline to how you live your life?
Yeah, I try to. I would say it's more difficult now to be structured because the founder says they can meet you right on Tuesday. Like, I need to be there in Seattle or San Francisco or Miami or wherever it is on Tuesday, right? I don't control my own schedule. So I would say that's the one thing that's a little different.
I know you don't like naming quarterbacks that you played with, but if you could have been coached by anybody and played with anybody that you didn't play with, who would they have been? Quarterback and coach.
I would say definitely be probably Andy Reid. I just always admired him. Like, he's a player's coach and also a very disciplined and structured in how he organizes his teams. And then I would say Tom Brady, because he's the greatest player, winner, competitor that the game has ever seen. And so like, his ability to not only will himself, but the will of people around him, I've always just deeply admired that.
What do you feel like you have left to conquer? Like, what are you going to do with the next 10 years of your life?
That's multifaceted. So professionally, there's a lot that I want to do in terms of growing my business. There's a lot of philanthropic work. There's some organizations that I love partnering here. You know, there's a man that I really look up to, Stanley Druckenmiller, what he's been able to accomplish with Harlem School Zone, with Jeffrey Canada, and the lives that he's been able to change for a lot of inner city youth through education is something I deeply admire and would love to be able to grow further in that. Obviously, my children are really important to me, and making sure that I'm doing everything in my power to help them reach their goals, and be able to do it in a way that, you know, cultivates great relationships, cultivates, you know, keeping the Lord first in their life, doing things with integrity. You know, so those are the things I think about for 10 years out that are really important to me.
Thank you for spending the time. I look around here. This is going to be Larry Fitzgerald Stadium here in a couple of weeks. Incredible honor.
Thank you, my
You're the
brother.
best, man. I love you.
You, D.